The winter wind cut across the Prussian plains like a warning, sharp and bitter, carrying with it the weight of an empire on the brink of collapse. Smoke curled over the distant hills where French troops had marched only days before, their drums echoing like thunder in a land shaken to its core. In the heart of this turmoil stood a queen whose resolve seemed carved from something stronger than marble and fiercer than the storm gathering overhead. Her name was Louise, Queen Louise of Prussia, beloved by her people and feared, quietly, by those who underestimated her will. It was said that when she spoke of her homeland, her voice carried the warmth of a mother and the fire of a commander. And now, as Prussia staggered beneath the crushing force of Napoleon's advance, her voice would ignite something far greater than courage. It would summon resistance. She rode through the chilled morning mist, her breath forming clouds in the air, her cloak brushing against the flanks of her horse. Around her, villagers watched from doorways, their faces pale, their hands trembling as they clutched what little they had left. Louise met their eyes one by one. Tired mothers holding children, old men who had survived too many winters, young boys whose futures hung in the balance. She offered them a nod, not of pity but of strength, as if to say she carried their fear with her and would not let it silence them. Word had spread across Prussia. The queen herself was on the march. But the story did not begin on this cold day. It began years earlier, when Louise was still a young woman of grace, curiosity, and a disarming sincerity that won hearts before she even realized she possessed such power. Born into a duchy quiet and refined, she had grown up with books, music, and the belief that rulers exist to serve their people, not to demand from them. When she married Frederick William III, she stepped into a kingdom steeped in discipline and military tradition, yet strained by inefficiency and complacency. She observed it quietly at first, learning the rhythms of court, the expectations, the constraints. But Louise was not made for passivity. When war loomed and decisions faltered, she spoke with courage even when the room grew still. Those who served at her side often said there was something luminous about her, a resilience disguised as gentleness. And in the early days of Napoleon's rise, when German lands trembled and Europe changed shape overnight, she understood that Prussia could not survive with hesitation. The king, earnest but cautious, wavered between diplomacy and defense, hoping against hope that compromise might tame the French storm. Yet Louise sensed the tide long before most ministers dared admit it. She stood beside her husband late into the night, maps unfurled across the table, candlelight flickering, her voice steady as she urged him toward resolve. "We cannot wait for dignity," she told him gently. "We must act to protect it." The French advance hit Prussia with a force that cracked the very foundation of its old military pride. Battles were lost in days where generals had expected weeks. Cities fell with scarcely a chance to defend themselves. Soldiers marched back exhausted, defeated, bewildered by the speed and precision of the enemy. And throughout the chaos, Louise traveled tirelessly, to camps, to villages, to the king's councils, bringing with her the kind of strength that did not need armor to be felt. She knelt beside wounded soldiers and asked their names. She held the hands of widows who had no one left. Her presence was a reminder of what was at stake. Not just land, but the soul of a nation. And then came the march. The resistance march, as it would be called in the years to follow. It was not a single event but the culmination of a rising tide of determination, one that Louise herself had stirred. With Prussia's armies scattered and winter threatening to cripple what little defense remained, she knew that the people themselves had to rise, not in blind rebellion but in unity and resolve. She traveled from Königsberg to Memel, rallying officers, reinforcing alliances, urging her people to stand firm not only in arms but in spirit. The march began at dawn. Soldiers, officers, farmers, blacksmiths, and students gathered at the city's edge, unsure of what the day would bring. The ground was frozen hard beneath their boots. Snow dusted their shoulders. Many carried worn weapons. Others bore only what tools they had. But all eyes turned when Louise appeared. She wore a simple military-style coat, her hair pulled back beneath a fur-lined hood, her posture upright despite the exhaustion she carried. She dismounted only when she reached the front of the assembled crowd, the crunch of ice beneath her feet barely audible over the tense silence. "My friends," she began, her voice clear but gentle, "Prussia has known fear. But today we choose courage." She paused, letting the words settle. We march not to conquer, but to endure. We march not because we are strong, but because we refuse to surrender what makes us strong. Our honor, our families, our homeland. If our children are to inherit peace, then we must give them the gift of resilience. The air shifted. Shoulders straightened. Hands tightened on weapons. Something invisible but unmistakable passed through the crowd. And so they marched, step by step, across the cold plains where French patrols prowled and uncertainty stalked the land. The sun climbed slowly above them, its faint warmth barely reaching the earth. Yet the column pressed on, their breath rising like smoke from a living furnace of determination. As they traveled, Louise spoke with commanders, mapped out defensive positions, and crafted strategies to avoid direct confrontation until reinforcements could arrive from allied regions. Her understanding of terrain, timing, and morale astonished even seasoned officers. She insisted on rotating the marchers to prevent exhaustion, ensured the sick were sheltered in nearby farmhouses, and delivered rousing words precisely when spirits began to falter. Every step you take, she reminded them, is a step toward freedom. But resistance does not go unnoticed. Scouts brought word that a French detachment, small but skilled, was approaching from the west. The Prussian forces were ill-equipped for a direct clash. Morale was rising but fragile. Retreat was an option, but one that would fracture the unity she had fought so hard to build. Louise gathered her officers beneath the skeletal branches of a winter oak and studied the map spread across a fallen log. Her brow furrowed in concentration. Yet her voice remained calm as she laid out the plan. They would use the terrain to their advantage. A narrow valley lay ahead, bordered by steep ridges thick with barren trees. The marchers would continue into the valley, appearing vulnerable, but two flanking units, small, swift, and hidden among the ridges, would wait for the signal. If the French entered the choke point, the Prussians would control the high ground, forcing the enemy into retreat or forcing them to pause long enough for the main column to advance safely. It was a strategy of intelligence, not brute strength, and it reflected Louise's belief that a weakened army must think like a living organism. Flexible, quick, unpredictable. As they entered the valley, tension clung to the air. The sound of boots on frozen earth grew louder, heavier. Louise rode at the center, her eyes fixed forward, the hilt of her sheathed sword cold against her glove. Scouts signaled from the distance. Movement was approaching. The French had taken the bait. What happened next unfolded like a measured pulse. The French cavalry advanced with practiced confidence, expecting the marchers to scatter. But instead of panic, they met a line of calm determination. Louise raised her hand, and the hidden units moved silently into position. A horn sounded, a single, clear note that carried through the valley like a command written in the wind. From the ridges, the Prussian flanking units emerged, their movement swift and coordinated. They did not charge recklessly. They positioned themselves to block escape routes and limit the French maneuverability. The French commander hesitated, realizing too late that the valley was no simple passage, but a trap shaped by intellect rather than force. He attempted to pull his troops back, but Louise had anticipated the move. She directed her forward officers to advance, not in a chaotic rush, but in a steady formation that pressed the enemy toward the ridges. The confrontation was tense, loud, filled with the clash of determination rather than detailed brutality. What mattered most was the shift in momentum. For the first time in months, Prussia pushed the French back, not with overwhelming military superiority, but with strategy shaped by a queen who refused to let despair dictate the future. The French detachment retreated, leaving the valley to the marchers. For a heartbeat, silence ruled the land. Then cheers erupted, raw, relieved, triumphant. Men who had doubted their strength lifted their weapons skyward. Women who had joined to support the march embraced one another with tears frozen at the edge of their lashes. Louise did not celebrate openly. She allowed the people their victory while she watched the horizon, knowing this was only the beginning. But when she finally turned back to her soldiers, her smile, soft, proud, luminous, carried more warmth than any fire could have offered. The march gained momentum. News of the valley resistance spread quickly, reaching Prussian towns and villages like a spark leaping across cold timber. More volunteers joined. Supplies were donated. Allied envoys arrived with renewed interest. Even the king, weary from political strain, found hope in the determination his wife had ignited. Her influence extended beyond morale. She pushed for reforms in the military, arguing for merit-based promotions, improved training, and modernized tactics. She understood that resistance was not merely about surviving. It was about reshaping a nation so it would never again be caught unprepared. But resistance demands sacrifice. Louise fell ill during the harshest part of the winter, her lungs strained by the relentless travel, her body weakened by exhaustion. Yet she refused to abandon the people. Wrapped in blankets, she continued to advise, strategize, and inspire from her bedside when she could not stand. Officers came to her tent or the small rooms where she rested, receiving her guidance like lifelines in uncertain waters. "A queen's strength," she told them once, her voice barely above a whisper, "is not measured by how loudly she commands, but by how deeply she serves." Though her health faltered, her spirit did not. As spring approached, the march transformed from a desperate movement of survival into a symbol of national rebirth. Prussia emerged from the winter battered but unbroken, and Louise's efforts laid the foundation for reforms that would ultimately strengthen the kingdom's military and political future. Her resistance was not measured in the number of battles she won, but in the resolve she created. A resolve that would outlive her. She would not live to see the final victory over Napoleon. Her illness worsened, and in 1810 she passed away at the age of 34, mourned by a nation that understood too late how deeply she had shaped its destiny. Yet her legacy marched on without her. The army she helped unify, the pride she rekindled, and the reforms she demanded became the backbone of Prussia's eventual resurgence. When the war finally turned and Napoleon fell, many whispered that Louise's spirit had marched with every soldier who reclaimed their homeland. And so the story ends not with a single event, but with a legacy that echoes through time. Queen Louise's resistance march was more than a moment of defiance. It was the heartbeat of a nation learning to stand again. She showed her people that leadership is not defined by titles or thrones, but by courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Her footsteps still echo in the cold valleys and snow-covered roads where she once rode, reminding every generation that even in darkness, greatness can rise from compassion, determination, and the unyielding belief that a nation's spirit cannot be conquered as long as even one voice chooses to resist.